I understand and know God. I understand and know God. I would like some feedback. How does that come across when you hear that? What do you hear? I only got 30 minutes.
Arrogance.
Arrogance.
Or stiff.
Stiff. I understand and know God. How's that come across? Arrogance, stiff. Third one.
I mean, it sounds good, like that's what we should have, but it does feel odd for some reason.
Okay.
Maybe it's just the tone of which you're saying it.
Why do you say sounds arrogant?
Yeah, it was that the manner which you said.
The manner.
Yeah.
Stiff.
Yeah, just tone of voice, body language.
Mm-hmm. The intensity. Well, tentatively, what a tragedy. And I would love to encourage a different perspective and in why understanding and knowing God is actually fundamental to your character and for your well-being. So, jumping into Jeremiah 9:23-24, thus says Yahweh, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom, let not the mighty man boast in his might, let not the rich man boast in his riches, but let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am Yahweh who practices chesed, steadfast love, loyalty, kindness, mercy, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For it is in these things I delight, declares Yahweh. And I think it's so fascinating that he's saying declares Yahweh. It's not something that's being written like up here before the quotations. He's saying declares it. And so I like to break down a few of these words. First one is to boast, is the Hebrew word halal, and it is not the food. So it means to praise, to boast, to shine, to celebrate, to glory. And at first, when I was like, to glory, that's interesting. The King James Version actually had the word to glory instead of boast, and I was going to share that verse instead when I was looking up the word, and it seemed like it had a really good definition. But then something in the back of my mind is like, I should look up what boast means to kind of figure out what kind of nuances are in the word. And I come to find out to boast means to talk with excessive pride and self-satisfaction about one's achievements, possessions, or abilities. And what I find is very interesting is that God's saying, don't talk with excessive pride and self-satisfaction about one's achievements and their wisdom, the richness of their possessions, or the abilities of their might, but instead to talk with excessive pride, self-satisfaction about one's achievement, possession, or ability in understanding and knowing Him, which I think is a very fascinating concept. And so I would like to figure out, what does that mean? Another word I want to look at is to know. It means yada, or the Hebrew word is yada. To know, perceive, to understand, to acknowledge. Yada is used to describe intellectual awareness, experiential knowledge, and intimate familiarity. And it implies a deep personal and relational knowledge. So we find this word being used like when Adam knew Eve, or they knew the knowledge of good and evil. They internalized a very intimate familiarity with a person or a concept like good and evil, but then also we are required to have that kind of intimate familiarity and intimate internalization of our God. The other word I want to look at is to understand. Now, in Hebrew, there are two different words for it that render as understanding, and we did see that with yada, but that one's kind of more talking about the intimate familiarity, as I explained. But there's another word that means understand, which is the word being. Being makes more sense in our Western mind. Being is to discern, distinguish between right and wrong, to perceive or to understand. Sakal, when I was looking up its definition, is to be prudent, to act wisely, to prosper, and to have success, which made no sense in the context of what he was talking about. And especially if I try to put any of those words in the verse, I have to add extra words to them. So like, for instance, I have to act wisely Is it because of God, for God, with God? Because we say we understand God, but not understand with God, or there's no, but all of these words kind of have an extra word that necessarily that we need to make it make sense in the sentence. So I went a little bit dive deeping into what sakal means, and I found out there's a whole labyrinth, or there's a deeper meaning and undertone of what the word actually is trying to communicate. So sakal is the process of thinking through a complex arrangement of thoughts, resulting in a wise dealing and use of good practical common sense, also emphasizing the end result being success. And so there's an invitation that there is a complexity of trying to understand your God, because there's him, but then there's this broken world that we live in, and trying to reconcile the two together is actually a feat, is an achievement. It's a very hard thing to do, but that is something that he is inviting us into. And another one I discovered, I'll read from this direction. Sakal suggests a keen sense of understanding and the ability to navigate situations astutely. Yet it is about more than mere intellectual understanding. It's about a deep-seated wisdom that informs decisions and behaviors. Sakal invites believers into a deeper understanding and application of divine wisdom, urging their hearts toward actions that align with God's heart and purposes. This wisdom is both a gift from God and something to be ardently pursued by the believer. An achievement, a possession, and an ability. And so I would like to exercise sakal with you today. Like, what would that look like? Yada, I believe, is kind of more your personal life as you start to intimately become familiar with God and how he interacts with your life. But then sakal, I wanted to use the story of Joseph to exercise, like, what would it look like to go through the process of really trying to understand God and wrestling with who he is. And I have the story of Joseph, at least just the points, so you can become familiar with around what I'm going to be talking about, because I'm just going to zero in. I unfortunately can't do the whole story because I only have 30 minutes. But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to approach Joseph two different ways. The first one is going to be a negative one. It's going to be one where we're having these wrestlings, these thoughts, these conclusions, and it just doesn't make sense. And so if you find yourself a little uncomfortable, just remember the first one is a negative one on purpose. The next one is, what would it might look like when we arrive to the other side of, like, wait, we understand who God is and his purposes and what it kind of looks like on that other side of that wrestling. So, first one, I'm going to go through points 3 through 7. So we have Joseph's brothers hated him. His brothers plotted to kill him. Judah had Joseph sold to the merchants, and when they showed Jacob the coat, he tore his clothes and put sackcloth and mourned for his presumably dead son. Okay, God, we just read in Jeremiah that you practice steadfast love and justice. Not only practice it, but you enjoy, you delight in these things. And yet I see right here that you are having Joseph being completely annihilated by his brothers through hatred, isolation, and then you have this over-fondness of Jacob toward Joseph, which is not even Joseph's fault. And then the brothers completely destroy their father's heart by showing him the cloak, leading him to believe that his son is dead. And one of your patriarchs is mourning for 23 years unnecessarily, if we look at the rest of the story. How is that loving? What a part of that is just that you say you seem to delight in so much and that you practice? I see none of that right now. Okay, 11. Potiphar put Joseph in prison. Okay, God, you said you delight in justice. Joseph is literally saying, why would I do this wickedness and evil to my God when Potiphar's wife is trying to invite him to lay with him? He's actually walking in your name, and the justice that you've given him is prison. What kind of justice is that? You said you exercise justice and you delight in it. That's not, as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't look like justice to me. Next one, 12. Yahweh extends Hesed. Well, that's nice. Or steadfast love. At least you made it a little more comfortable for him, I guess. Making him have the favor and whatnot. Whatever he does succeeds. But wouldn't it be more loving if you were to reconcile him with his father and not have this unnecessary splitting between his families? I don't understand. That doesn't seem like love to me. And on the last one we go is 26. Joseph says, he said what they meant for evil against him, God meant for good. Oh, wonderful. God, I'm just going to have to say it. It seems like you use people to get what you want at their cost, at their expense, at their loss. While you sit up there completely separated from all of the pain that they have to go through in order to get to what you desire. I don't know if I can serve a God like that. How are we doing? I have to say, I think this is good. This is the first step of sakal. We recognize a few things when that happens. We discover misguided beliefs. And those misguided beliefs come from things that we think we understand about justice, what we understand about love. What are we reading into the text? So we have events in our lives, traumas and experiences where we might see something that's kind of similar to something that we've gone through, and we match all of the stuff that we felt in that moment, and the disorientation and the frustration and the hurt, and gets plastered onto the text. And you're realizing like how much this actually could really be painful. Wait a minute, and this is just okay? How is this okay? And so we get to recognize, oh, wait a minute, there's maybe something that I'm reading into this. What is it? And then raw, honest conclusions where it's just like, God, it just seems like you just use people to get to your point at their expense. Like, and how do you reconcile something like that, and how you get through to the other side of that kind of conclusion that you're having about God? And so you could stay there. And many people do. They say, I don't want a God like that. I don't even want to serve him. And they go on their other way. Or we can wrestle through it and get to this other side. And something we recognize is that we have perception and expectations that are completely whacked based off of the life that we live and the hurts that we experience. But if we meditate and truly seek God and at the core of who he is, we can start arriving to understanding him and be able to see the text a little bit differently. So from 3 to 7, I'm actually going to revisit it. It's not going to be something I start off with right away, and I'll explain why in a second. 11, with Potiphar putting Joseph in prison, this is what I think is just funny. So God's literally telling Joseph, I delight in your righteousness. You're getting a promotion. A promotion? Like, yeah, I am taking you to the next level. You have shown me your character and your quality, and I am putting you into the next level. And it's like, what do you next level? I'm literally going down, not up. Well, it's like, yes, Joseph, what you don't realize is that you're literally a bullet next in the chamber, being ready to get set off into something you don't really know yet, and you don't know when. But what's happening is something so much far greater and bigger, and what you have shown me is that you love me. You actually will stand behind my name, and that is what's most important. And I'm not constrained by the justice system of people making the wrong accusations, blah, blah, blah. I'm actually using it for my sake. And in God's wisdom, he knows how to actually put this thing together. But the biggest thing is that this is actually showing Joseph's quality, and he is being set up for something so much greater, being put into this darker space. And so this can also be tied into yada, when you are finding yourself in a spot where it's like, I did the right thing though. God, how did I end up with this negative situation when I was trying to walk in what I believed was honorable to you? And so if you find yourself going lower for any reason, like, okay, maybe God is setting up something far greater that is beyond what we expect the one-to-one to be. I do something righteous, and he blesses me just and goes up as much as we think that sometimes it's supposed to happen. And then with 12, Yahweh extended hesed to Joseph, giving him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. This is just such a fascinating thing. I think it's such a kindness that God allowed a moment, instead of just saying Joseph went to prison and just went with that and said how he rose him up and everything he did was successful. But God actually had written, Yahweh extended chesed to Joseph when he went to his lowest place. In chesed, one of the definitions is loyalty. And especially as like us men, we find that we are always looking for like a loyal friend to be through thick and thin no matter what, and especially want to find that like in a spouse. But something I find here is that God is like a loyal companion, and as we're being drawn into this deeper, darker spot, like God saw the heartbreak that Joseph was in. He saw the confusion that he was in. He's like, I didn't deserve to be here. Like, I'm stolen out of the land of the Egyptians, and I did not do anything to deserve this kind of punishment. And yet God is like, he sees that, and he's walking into the darker space with him with such a compassion and such a generosity to allow like him to thrive in this place. And he didn't take away the situation that he was in. He didn't take away the hardship of that. He also didn't take away the fact that his brothers hated him. He didn't take away the fact that Jacob was way more fond of him, which spurred on the brothers' hatred. He didn't take away Laban's dishonesty, which then probably spurred on Jacob's over-fondness to get his wife of 14 years and couldn't get kids by her until like way at the end, and she finally dies. And so you can, and then behind, like before that and before that and before that, all the way to Adam and Eve, God didn't take away the humanity of all of these things that are happening, but one day he is going to reconcile everything, because there's like a perspective of like, everything's supposed to be right, everything's supposed to be good. Well, he's going to make everything right and everything good in the New Jerusalem. But right now, there is kind of a strange limitation in the complexity of humanity, and God enters into the human space with us and is able to guide into his purposes, but then also understand that there is a hardship in it, and is very kind and generous. And so like, that's another thing I think is a very necessary practice for us, is to recognize, where has God shown and extended his chesed when you have entered into your dark spot? And that would be practicing like yada, because you're truly starting to intimately understand your God and how he now is walking in it with you. He's not removing the situation, he's not removing the trial or the issue, but instead he is giving you the strength, the fortitude, protection, provision, and to recognize like, oh wait, I've seen you, God, work in my life. As soon as this turn happened, I can actually see that you are walking it with me. Because a lot of times when we enter into these dark places, it's kind of like when Job says, I cannot perceive you when I step forward, step behind, to the side to side. I do not perceive my God. But that's what hurt does. But if we can actually look back and to recognize, wait a minute, God was with me along the way, and here's how he's come through. And another thing that I think is so frustrating with this verse especially, there's so many people that I've heard, they want Joseph to deserve prison so badly. They're willing to like read in, well, God's just trying to get him humble. God's just trying to shape him up. God's just trying to, like, we want a cruel God so badly, it seems like, that we completely read in that we need Joseph to have a just reason to be in prison. It's like, okay, if he's needing to be humbled, that makes sense. But then a couple things. One, Joseph has already shown his quality. The reason why he's in prison is because he actually stood with his God and didn't go with Potiphar's wife and proclaim that he is like, I do not want to do this evil thing to his God. So that's kind of ruled out of the picture. But then two, we overlook the very thing that's actually written, which is God's love and gentleness and compassion toward Joseph. And we completely overlook that and read into our own like desire to see God a lot more just in our perspective and how we expect it to be. So it's just like we miss out on the tenderness and compassion of who God is in the desire to like find a God that is cruel. I don't know how to put it. I just think it's so frustrating, and we overlook a very key character of who God is in doing that. And so for 21, Judah offers himself to Joseph to protect Benjamin. And this is where I have to say, this, I believe, is God's justice. And like, what do you mean justice? Well, it's like, well, what would be our justice? Our justice would have been, those brothers would have gotten leprosy. That justice would have been, they got killed somehow. Like some kind of obvious justice that have been served to them that they really seem to deserve. And it's like, one of the chapters we had, there was a son that was evil in the sight of the Lord, and so God killed him. It's like, well, that makes sense. That's pretty simple. Evil in the sight of the Lord, God kills him. But this was evil too. And so why did they not receive that? And so in God's justice, there is such a long suffering. He is slow to anger, and he actually desires for people to reconcile. And so if our justice were to prevail, there would not have been an opportunity for redemption, which is actually what God desires so much more. And so when we find ourselves also like wrestling with the hurts from other people, and we're really frustrated, like, why did they do this to me? And I want them to know how I felt with when they hurt me and whatnot, and having some kind of justice be exercised onto them. But then you have to stop and realize, where's the justice that was served you when you hurt so-and-so, and they actually are struggling with trust now because of your sin? You can end up forgetting that there was a justice that was deserved you, but instead there was an opportunity for redemption and turnaround. And so, and interestingly, when I was talking to somebody, they were saying that justice can also be translated as righteousness. So like, this is also the righteousness of God. That there is this redemption and this turnaround, and that there's this reconciling, which I think is quite fascinating. And that kind of forces us to have a different perspective when it comes to justice and rightness, things coming back to how it needs to be. And so the last one I would go to is 26. What he meant for evil, God meant for good, to bring it that many people should be kept alive. And this, I really love seeing how Joseph is arriving at a place. We see two things. He's content, and his character. Now, we saw his character kind of throughout the story, but I believe that he truly understood and knew his God. And so one of the conclusions I would have is understanding and knowing God equals contentment. He's in this situation. He's not bitter. He's not resentful. And he had every opportunity to like ruin their lives, but he instead cared about their heart. He wanted to know if they were still in the same place. And because he wasn't trying to tease them. He was truly wanting to know the quality of their character, which is fascinating when he could have been doing so much worse, and he actually cared more about their heart rather than his own like power. And the other thing I'd like to make a mention is that it is important to understand and know your God, because it is fundamental, or that is because that it is important to understand and know your God, because that fundamentally impacts the quality of your character. Because like a lot of times when I talk to people about understanding and knowing God, they kind of expect that like it's meaning you're understanding all the mysteries of God and what he's doing and where things are going. It's like, no, but unfortunately you've kind of cut yourself off, because there is an understanding and a knowing of God that is necessary. And God mentions in his passage in Jeremiah that it's about his character. And so when you go into situations, you're like, but I know my God. I understand my God. And I can walk into these situations knowing his purposes, and I can align myself with that and be okay, be content. And so I would very much want to encourage people to seek to understand and know their God. Because this line, when I was researching sakal, just really grabbed me. If your faith isn't grappling with real issues, then it's probably too naive to be worth sharing. And I find that if a lot of times we don't want to face the really hard questions that kind of bring up our doubts and insecurities, and we kind of have these quick Christian ideologues that we stand behind that are supposed to kind of hide ourselves from the fact that we actually are really struggling with hard questions with God and reconciling between God being righteous and the world being messy, and then my life is like not coming out the way I was hoping it would. But when you actually are wrestling with understanding and knowing God, this is what I think is the fundamental start of developing strong believers. And without it, we have a weak congregation. And so I would just like to encourage all of you to truly seek to understand and to know your God.